Enough news this week to last a month. Non-stop barrages pound northern Israel. A vote in the Knesset deepens Israel's rift. Gantz leaving the government. And the most daring hostage rescue mission we have seen since the beginning of the war. It's unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12, usually in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's unholy, two Jews on the news. Like you say, lots of news. I mean, my day job requires me to be focusing on what was meant to be the big story of this period, the summer general election. Let's just first of all query the word summer, because I'm talking to you in a place that has not seen sunlight for some time. I mean, our idea of a kind of summer diversion, I was meant to be going to the cricket this evening. The forecast is for non-stop rain. But even the election is not quite living up to billing. I mean, I think people saw this opening moment, didn't they, of Rishi Sunak announcing the election as buckets of rain were dropped on top of him.
Did he have to do that in the rain, or just happened while he was talking?
No, I mean, it's so strange because it had been raining and then there was this break, but everyone thought, you know, if you know this country, it pauses for 40 seconds and then starts raining again, you know. And his advisors were, you know, apparently were torn on this issue. The optics are you normally announce it outside Downing Street, but you know what? Do it in a room with a roof. So that was, and he sort of started as he meant to go on, really, because it's been just one optics nightmare after another. But to the point where some people are, you know, I've written it, a couple of people have written, is this maybe not an election campaign? Is it maybe a kind of performance art installation? You know, where Rishi Sunak is trying to stage the most hapless, tin-eared campaign you've ever seen. Anyway, I mean, we mustn't dwell on this because it's just my obsession. But last week was the D-Day commemorations, you know, a very big deal in the British collective memory. And he went there to the beaches of northern France, but left early. And so there's a photograph of world leaders on the beach, Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz, and then David Cameron, former Prime Minister, now Foreign Secretary, deputising for the Prime Minister, who had to go back to do a pre-recorded interview with, you know, one of the TV networks here. Wasn't even live. Why did he have to do it? So you begin to think maybe it's like Jewish reference. Maybe it's a bit like Max Bialystock and Leo Bloom in The Producers, who deliberately want their show to fail. You know, is that what's going on here? Anyway, that's the sort of, you know, daytime activity for me as a Guardian writer, but obviously lots and lots of news going on in your part of the world.
Luckily, Israeli politics is so boring. You have nothing to talk about, really, right?
It's like, you know, it's the weather and politics, and neither of them compare to what's going on where you are.
Yeah, you guys got the weather all wrong. That we know. That's a conclusion we can arrive at. So, I mean, there's so much going on. Where do you want to start from and what is happening in Israel? Obviously, a big story, as we talk on Thursday, is the barrages coming from the north. We will go into all that with our special guest, Amos Harel. I mean, do we want to start with the major mission rescue operation this week, which left Israelis, you know, finally smiling after such a long time, and realizing that good news is still possible in the world we live in. I mean, it's been a few days, but still just that moment when every Israeli, and I think we can also say it extended to the Jewish world, this sort of moment of happiness, knowing that Noah Argamani and Shlomi Ziv and Almog Meirjan and Andrei Kozlov, all of them abducted from the Nova party, are okay. Noah Argamani really becoming the way she was abducted, and her personal story with her mother having terminal cancer, all of that. She became, I think, a symbol of the horrendous act Hamas did on October 7th, abducting these young people from a party. She's 26 years old. I think only a person with no heart could not have tears in his eyes to see that picture of her and her father reuniting at the hospital. She looked well. She looked okay. You know, she was sitting with her friends. She's this young a woman who her life essentially stopped on October 7th. And so many people were so worried about what had happened to her. And here it was, the rescue mission of the IDF, the special forces of the police, and all of them, the Shin Bet, of course, all of them together in this really heroic mission, the Israel that we want to believe we still are, really. And I think that was, I think, the highlight of this week.
Yeah, I mean, and you say about around the Jewish world, it really did go round. And one of those 4 hostages you mentioned, for example, is one of those hostages adopted by the Jewish community I'm a member of. You know, there is a chair in the synagogue each week with a photograph of a missing a hostage still in captivity, and there's half a dozen of them, and the pictures change each week. And Shlomi Ziv was one of those, and his face was there, present, and in his absence as a member of our congregation. So it absolutely went round the Jewish world. I think one thing that I particularly found very moving was the sight, and again, these went viral, of these notes that were put on the doors of people who are Orthodox, religiously observant, and therefore, because it happened on Shabbat, on the Sabbath, weren't able to know, didn't have the radio on or their phones on, and therefore letting neighbors know that, look, 4 hostages have been released. It was wonderful news.
And of course, all you need to know about Israel, that was 15 seconds of a lifeguard on a beach telling everyone there that the hostages have been released, and everyone, cheering. That's all you need to know about Israel in those 15 seconds, really.
Now, and one of the points that you and I have talked about a lot is that to be outside Israel in these moments is to be in that narrative, and like I mentioned, with the synagogue and so on. And on the other hand, you are seeing things exposed to the narrative that people outside put. And, I have to say that as soon as there was that coverage, a lot of the international media then switched their focus very rapidly to the price paid for this raid and to concentrate on the dozens, scores, even a couple of hundred of Palestinians who were killed in that raid. I mention it because that twin experience is what it is to be following this from outside. In Israel, I suspect that the attention goes immediately just to the 4, and people want to have interviews with the family and so on. But outside, there's always that, twin track in the coverage. And so it was in this case. I think we're going to get into that when we speak with our guest, Amos Harel.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, to me, of course, always sort of also aware of what is going on outside Israel, but that realization, right, that people criticize Israel for trying to rescue its hostages, and then Hamas shooting at the people trying to rescue the hostages inside a very, dense area of Gaza, IDF shooting back, and then Israel being blamed for all that. I know that common sense is become quite scarce since October 7th, but this was a new height to that. Obviously, we'll get back into all that with our special guest. Listen, there are a lot of other things happening in Israel this week as well. As we said, and we teased this for a few episodes. Also, last episode, Benny Gantz finally leaving the Netanyahu government, saying that Netanyahu is politicizing the war, saying there must be elections, saying there also must be a commission of inquiry. This is not the way Benny Gantz wanted to leave the government. I think he wanted to leave earlier, and he definitely wanted his departure to have a larger effect on the Israeli public. As it stands, he is in the polls relatively losing some power compared to the situation when he's in 2 or 3 months ago. I definitely wanted it to have another effect, but we're still in the sort of in this event happening. I think it's not only a political event, it's also on the diplomatic level. This is important. This was the moderate side of the government. Remember, Netanyahu always likes to have this leverage where he has the more moderate side of his government, the more far right side of his government. Always, this is what he would do, right? He would talk to the right side and say, but listen, the left is pressuring me, or talk to the left side and say, the right is pressuring me. He doesn't like to be in this situation where he is actually the left flank of his government, now that the moderate side of it has left the building.
Yeah, I mean, the dynamic that we'll be watching very closely is between him and his defense minister, Yoav Gallant. And, they're not easily, or Gallant anyway, isn't easily put in a box left or right, because sometimes he has been the more and most hawkish voice around the table. We're told that immediately after October 7, it was he, I think 3 or 4 days later, who wanted to launch an offensive on the north, and he was held back by Netanyahu. Gantz and Eisenkot were against that too. So, it doesn't fit and yet, on other issues, including ones we're going to talk about, he has been, as it were, on the left of those issues. So in this dynamic of the two of them is going to be very, very interesting to watch. But no, I mean, I think we've said before, I think Gantz lacks one of the great political skills, which is timing.
Which is politics.
He doesn't really have much in the way of politics, but timing is so important. And it does feel as if this would have been a very powerful move in January or February. Instead, he let it pass the moment where it was past ripe. And so it has a limited effect. In a way, it doesn't endear him to either the left or right, because the left think you left it too late. The right think you've abandoned the helm of the ship. So it's and limited effectiveness. So once again, I think it has been, unfortunately, in other ways too, a week that has left the prime minister, as it were, and quite literally smiling. We'll talk about all of that.
I should mention that what Gantz and Eisenkot tried to do really is to bring back the hostages, and they thought this is also not a very good sign. They thought as long as there is a chance for them to do that, they should stay. This either says enough is enough, or that they think that the fact that they would remain in the government wouldn't make a difference. That's also a big tragedy, because after saying everything we did about the rescue mission, it's very clear that the large bulk of the hostages that can come home will come home with a deal, and that we don't see in the horizon right now. Another important development politically is the vote in the Knesset about the draft bill. We should just rewind that a little bit and say there's a conscript army in Israel, mandatory service. The ultra-orthodox are, for the large part, exempt from that for all sorts of historical reasons. But the bill that kept them exempt from military service expired. What is needed is to write a new bill, but we are in the middle of the war. So all this is becoming very, very contentious. The High Court of Justice telling the government, if you don't write a new bill quickly, two things might happen. The ultra-Orthodox that have been exempt thus far will be conscripted, and the funding for the yeshivot where they study Torah is going to be cut. Two things that the ultra-Orthodox parties, part of the coalition, Netanyahu's coalition, can't accept. Now, Netanyahu pulled something of a trick. We explained this a few weeks ago. What he did was take the exemption bill written in the last government, the Bennett government. It was presented by the then defense minister, Gantz. And Netanyahu essentially saying, hey, I'm going to bring this as the new bill. To do that, he needed a continuation vote, saying that you can continue the legislation from where you left it in the last government. And he won in that vote this week. The problem with this being, first of all, we should note that Defense Minister Gallant, you said you can't easily put him in a box. He voted against that continuation, which is very significant, because you have the head of the defense system, defense echelon, saying, I'm not agreeing to this bill at all. And this is a bad look for Netanyahu. You saw that smile he had on his face. He was very pleased with the vote itself. This is not good for him in his own base, the Likud base specifically, basically saying to Israelis as clear as you can, all citizens are equal, but some citizens are more equal than others. This is not a particularly good look for him at this point in time.
Yeah, I think so one of those things that people outside the country often don't quite grasp is how absolutely central this compulsory military service is, and the notion at wartime, when everybody else is either themselves risking their lives or sending their sons and daughters to risk their lives, the notion of a substantial percentage of the population, 12% or so, who are sheltered from that obligation, who do not risk their children's lives. It is so emotive at a time like this. And as you say, that will be felt not just on the sort of usual suspects of the left. There'll be plenty of old school Likud voters who think there has to be equality of sacrifice, equality of burden. And there's Netanyahu on the wrong side of that issue. I mean, obviously, I was heartened just by seeing somebody in the Likud vote against the Likud-led government, and Gallant doing that. I wish there were more behind him willing to do that, but it was something.
So clearly a lot to talk about, and a lot has been going on this week, and I think we have a perfect guest to do it with. Amos Harel is the military and defense analyst of Haaretz newspaper, and he has become, if he hasn't before, but definitely since the war, essential reading for anyone interested in what is going on inside Israel. Also a good friend of this pod. Amos, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for inviting me.
Let's start with the north. Obviously, a barrage of rockets over the northern part of Israel after a targeted killing of a Hezbollah commander. This move by Israel, a strategic one, tactical, opportunistic. How would you sort of define this? And where is this all heading?
It's much more of a tactical move than a strategic one, and it may be a result of the situation Israel finds itself in after more than 8 months of fighting. As you may recall, Hezbollah began launching rockets at Israel a day after the Hamas attack on the Gaza envelope communities. And since then, what you have is something which is short of full-scale war, just beneath a war, if you'd like to define it this way. And we've had Israel and Hezbollah swapping blows. We've had close to 60,000 Israeli refugees forced out of their homes in about a zone which is about 3 or 4 miles south of the Lebanese border, something that we've never encountered before. There is an even bigger number of Lebanese refugees who fled towards the Beirut area and the Bekaa area as well. And this hasn't been going on too well from an Israeli perspective. There are tactical achievements, but there are no decisive victories here. And the strategy isn't going anywhere. So I think more than anything else, this shows that there's a level of frustration among the IDF's top brass, because whatever we're doing, it doesn't tend to solve anything. The fighting continues, and Hezbollah begins every day with a barrage of rockets and attack drones. And Nasrallah has announced that there's no way a ceasefire will be achieved in the north before a ceasefire is reached in the south. Out of this frustration and growing criticism by the public against both the army and the government comes the decision to strike harder. The most recent attack on Tuesday night, as you mentioned, was against a top Hezbollah commander, something like a division commander in the Israeli army. This is the leader, the commander of the Nasser unit, which is in charge of the eastern part of the border with Israel. Once he was assassinated, we've had 2 days of massive attacks by Hezbollah. Still not exactly full-scale war, and yet Hezbollah picks targets that are deeper inside Israel, launching rockets and sending drones all the way down to the Sea of Galilee, all over the west coast of the Sea of Galilee, and also, I think it was close to 300 rockets in the last 2 days, all across the Galilee. So Haifa has not been hit yet, neither has Tel Aviv, and yet Nasrallah sends a signal that this is, from his view, unacceptable, and that he will escalate his reaction to Israeli actions.
I mean, you make the point that it's so far tactical. I'm just wondering, given the sheer might of Hezbollah's arsenal, the number of rockets it has, dwarfs anything Hamas have, what would a strategic response or plan against Hezbollah in the north look like?
An Israeli strategic response against Hezbollah would probably mean war. There are some generals who say we can have a few days of escalation, and then after swapping these messages, Hezbollah may think twice, his Iranian masters may think again, and then maybe a ceasefire would be reached, and Amos Harel could do his magic thing and reach a final agreement. Harel is, of course, the special envoy, Biden's special envoy to the area regarding the tensions on the Lebanese border. And yet the danger is, of course, that if you try something like that, for instance, hitting Beirut, something we haven't done yet, or hitting in a more extensive way the Bekaa Valley area, which is east of Beirut and quite far away from the Israeli border, this could probably very easily escalate into a full-scale war. And that would mean Hezbollah launching rockets, maybe 3,000 rockets a day, towards Tel Aviv, towards Haifa, towards central Israel, towards Israeli infrastructure targets. That would be very, very different than anything we've encountered before. You remember the last round of massive violence between Israel and Hezbollah occurred in 2006. And yet at that time, Hezbollah had about 13,000 rockets, and the most it could get was hit the Hadera area, which is about 30 miles north of Tel Aviv. By now, it's assumed that they have somewhere between 80,000 and 130,000 rockets and missiles. A few hundreds of those are considered to be accurate. And also, they have long-range missiles that could also reach even Eilat. It could hit actually every target in Israel. This doesn't mean that Hezbollah can actually win a round of war with Israel. I think this is not going to be the case. And yet the damage is something that we haven't encountered before. This is much more significant than anything that we've dealt with before. And the fact that Israeli leaders have been dealing with this or thinking about this so hard for so long has to do exactly with that. The fear that the home front would be hit on a much larger scale than we've seen before. And also there's, I think, a slight worry that even if the IDF does enter southern Lebanon and hits it using massive artillery, tanks, infantry units, and so on, that this could be costly, that perhaps we would not progress as fast as we can, and actually that Hezbollah has been preparing for that for many, many years, and that the outcome may be less than satisfactory from the Israeli point of view. Everybody knows that this would mean casualties both to civilians and to the military, and yet it's unclear whether Israel could reach a decisive victory. And even if it does, it's not, there's no flag on Iwo Jima here or on the Reichstag. You don't go all the way to Beirut. We've tried that with the PLO in 82. It got us stuck for 18 years in Lebanon. I think most Israelis would like to avoid that. However, there is a small group of rabbis that's organizing some kind of conference on June 17th regarding going back to Lebanon and settlements there. So there you have it.
So if we move from that extreme idea for a moment, I don't want to sound too despondent, but even if we are trying to be very optimistic and to say this is going to end with some sort of agreement, Hezbollah is going to be pushed back, maybe not until the Litani, but it's going to be far away, and this will not escalate to an all-out war. But the problem of Hezbollah, as you say, an arsenal of so many rockets targeting Israel potentially, how do you ever solve that? In a sense, it's an issue for the next 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, but it is a proxy of Iran sitting on Israel's northern border, amassing so much weaponry. How do you solve that without some sort of a preemptive strike and an all-out war eventually?
First of all, sometimes you don't solve it. Not all existential threats could be made to disappear. It's a very difficult problem, and it's no wonder that Israel has tried to avoid dealing with it for so many years. Remember, after 2006, the Iranians helped Hezbollah recover. Hezbollah was hit quite badly, although the war itself ended in a sort of a miserable draw. And later on, it's quite clear that what the Iranians did was rebuild Hezbollah in such a way which would help deter Israel from striking their nuclear site. That was the whole point, saving or protecting the Iranian nuclear program from an Israeli strike by threatening Israel with Hezbollah's power. Now, for many years, I think that most Israeli analysts and decision makers assumed that, there's a sort of a mutually assured deterrence here. Both sides are very strong. Both sides can create a lot of damage to the other side. The destruction would be horrible, and therefore they would try to avoid war. And since Iran, at least after the Obama administration reached the deal with Iran in 2015, it seemed that we were not positively going to a direct conflict with Iran. So you could, build your force, prepare for the worst case scenario, and yet try to avoid it. What happened after October 7th is, I think, first and foremost, and we talked about that in the pod before, Israelis are more concerned. Once we've seen Hamas, which is not a strong enemy, storm through our walls and fences and spread so much destruction in Israeli communities across the Gaza border, one cannot avoid the possibility or imagining the possibility of a scenario in which Hezbollah, which is much stronger, can do the same. So this is actually quite threatening from an Israeli point of view. And then you have the possibility that Iran may have gained some appetite because of this. Because if we look at the situation after 8 months, there's no clear victory for Israel. We were hit very badly on October 7th. We recovered. We hit Hamas in an even worse way. But we didn't solve the problem. It's not the end of the conflict there. And somebody like Khamenei was 85 years old. can think to himself, well, I have a few more years in power. Maybe I should try. Maybe I should go for the whole thing. Maybe I should go for the great plan to destroy Israel completely. He's been threatening Israel with that for years. Now, until October 7th, people like you and me could have, thought, okay, we're stronger, very aware of this. This is, they're playing their own games for domestic reasons, but they're never going to be as good as their word. They're never going to be crazy enough to try something like this. After October 7th, I'm not so sure. And this is why the Israeli decision makers are so worried about the situation right now. And what you have, on the one hand, are the residents of those communities in the Galilee who have been forced out of their homes and are frustrated and are used to a much stronger army, or at least their perception of the army is of a much stronger entity that could deal with everything. And suddenly people tell them, well, it's complicated and we don't know. The government is telling them, we don't know exactly when you're coming back. Then you have the ultra right-wing parties who demand a total victory over Lebanon. And then you have the generals themselves who are torn in between. Some of them say, no, this is a humiliation, a national humiliation. We need to deal with that. We can't go on forever with hundreds of rockets being launched every day. You know that almost every night on the evening news, I see your reports beginning with devastation and destruction in kibbutzim along the border. This is something that's unheard of for Israelis. And to have the country not being able to solve that, it's not only humiliating, it's troubling. So this is one part of the problem. The other is that some of those generals and some of those retired generals, like Israel Ziv, for instance, who you interview a lot on Channel 12, are concerned and are not necessarily sure that this is the right way, and that, in fact, the IDF could perform effectively on both fronts, Gaza and Lebanon, and that considering that we've been fighting for 8 months with mixed results at best, maybe this is not going to go on so well if we decide to finally strike in Lebanon.
Let me ask about when you say it's mixed results, one of the good bits of news that's come out, one of the very few, and that is the hostage rescue last weekend. Yonit and I were talking about it before, how it went around the world. I think there's endless interest in this. People understand how unbelievably difficult this is, densely packed area. The risk for the soldiers doing it, that just the minute they're present, the risk would be that the captors could hear them coming and decide to kill the hostages there and then. That's the stakes couldn't have been higher. So just tell us what you can about how this came about, who in the military level deserves the credit for this operation. And I suppose a question a lot of people will be asking is whether this is a one-off or whether this now suggests a kind of template that could be repeated with further rescues.
Maybe I should start with your last question. In my view, it's probably close to a one-off. We have been able to release 7 hostages in 8 months in 3 different operations. And yet all of those hostages were found and released above ground. We haven't seen a successful attempt underground in the Hamas tunnels. And since Hamas, has shown to be a quick study, probably Hamas will be able to learn its own, to study what has happened and draw its own conclusions from what has happened and change the way it protects what it sees as its greatest assets, those 120 Israeli hostages. So I'm not so hopeful about the possibility of doing this again. Some people, mostly Netanyahu supporters, are using this as proof that the opposition, their demands for a deal are wrong. This is the right way to go forward, and only military pressure and those brave soldiers could bring results. In reality, it's much more complicated and harder to do. I hope that we'll see, it's not a miracle, but it's a military miracle, if you'd like. People worked very, very hard for this. I don't know if some people prayed, but others worked very, very, very hard and planned and then acted, as you said, very bravely and courageously and managed to get those hostages out. It will be hard to repeat, considering that the enemy has its own way of learning from such mistakes. Now, regarding the operation itself, some people compare it to Entebbe in 76, and of course Netanyahu would like to ride that kind of wave because of his family history. And yet this is different. Entebbe was, they released more than 100 hostages, if I'm not mistaken, and it happened many, many miles away from Israeli soil. This happened close by. But as you said, the most difficult thing to do here was to act in a very densely populated area. I think in the end, this proves again what the army, it's not only the army, it's Shin Bet, and in this case, it's the actual unit operating was the Yamam, the special anti-terrorist force that belongs to the police. Now, these guys are professionals, and the way they work in such specific pinpoint operations, I don't want to use terms like the best in the world, but they're top of their game. They're not far away from the Brits or the Americans can do in a similar situation. And maybe, just maybe, the Israeli generals are willing to risk some more considering the circumstances and everything that has happened. So this has been done very professionally. Not a lot of people knew about it in advance. I talked this week to the division commander who was in charge of the operation. He told me that he had to keep a very close, small circle of officers around him who knew the secret. Others knew only that the division was maneuvering into the central area in the Gaza Strip. It's called the Central Area Refugee Camps, like Nuseirat, and they didn't even know that there was a hostage operation planned. They only knew in the last minute. So this is the way they kept the secret. They practiced for a few weeks. And once they had the full chance of getting there, they actually went all the way. We should, of course, know that one brave officer was killed during the operation. And your next question, I'm pretty sure, is going to be about the human cost on the other side.
He knows you well, Jonathan. He knows you well.
Yes, you read my mind there, because inevitably, and Yonit and I talked about it, while Jews around the world are celebrating the release of those 4 hostages, international attention goes on the price paid. And obviously there are different estimates, some 200 Palestinians killed in the process is one figure claimed. My question is, could that have been avoided? Is it possible to rescue hostages without incurring that kind of human cost on the other side?
Look, one of your British colleagues actually asked an Israeli spokesperson, why didn't you notify the poor residents of the Nuseirat refugee camp? Well, we both agree that this, in a better world, maybe this could have been done, but I'm not sure all of them would have been convinced to keep a secret. Just between you and me, we're coming this morning, stay away. Look, it's extremely complicated. And I, as you know from the past, from our conversations in the past, I don't like to be squeezed into the Hasbara corner. I'm not an official spokesperson for Israel. And yet, I think I would suspect some of the details and numbers coming out from the Hamas side. We've seen that before on Rafah. Most recently, we've seen that in previous incidents that could be used by the Palestinians, and of course, most famously in the attack on the Khan Yunis hospital that never occurred on October, if you remember the case with the Islamic Jihad rocket. So it's quite easy to play with the numbers. I'm not trying to say that there were not innocent civilians killed. We saw the videos. Some civilians were killed. Not everybody who died there was a civilian. I saw some of the videos. It was quite clear that these were men of the right age, so to speak. And as you know, Hamas is not moving around in uniform, in military uniform there. Once you make that decision to act in such a densely populated area, like the other risks the Israelis were taking, they were taking this risk as well. And yet, again, Hamas decided on the attack on October 7th, made civilians its main target, including old people, women, innocent children, and so on. And once you operate in such an area, and Hamas decided to hide them inside family apartments, among a very crowded area with civilians, I don't think Hamas can turn around and say to Israel, it's your fault. It's quite clear now that Hamas is having it both ways. Look, the most important piece of information I read this week is the Wall Street Journal's story day before yesterday. Somehow they were able magically to obtain some correspondence being made between Sinwar, the leader of Hamas in Gaza, in the tunnels, and Hamas's outside leadership in Doha. And Sinwar is being quoted as saying that actually he doesn't really care. We suspected that all along, but he doesn't really care about the price being paid on the Palestinian side. This was a necessary price. He compared that to the civil war in Algeria in the 50s. And he said, this is a necessary sacrifice. He talks to Ismail Haniyeh, who lost 3 of his sons and some grandsons in an Israeli strike. And he said, well, it's a price worth to pay for our freedom and our independence and so on. He's having it both ways in a way. Any civilian killed in Israeli action actually, to some extent, helps Hamas. And I think it's quite clear that there's an absolute disregard by Hamas to Palestinian lives. I have my criticism regarding Israeli action. I've talked about that and written about that quite a lot in recent months. I think that in many cases, the Israelis should have been much more careful about rules of engagement and so on. And yet, it's very, very hard to play this in a gentlemanly kind of way when you fight against such an enemy, especially because they work underground. We've talked about that in the past again. When Sinwar talks to his friends abroad, what he says is, we have the Israelis exactly where we wanted them, meaning stuck in Gaza, dealing with our underground tunnels and unable to reach a final decisive victory. This is exactly the case.
So 8 months, and let's just sort of pick up on how you ended that answer. 8 months in, obviously Israel bogged down in Gaza. United States suggests this idea, it's based on what Netanyahu agreed to essentially end, or at least temporary ceasefire, some hostages coming out as much as Israel can, and then somehow reaching an agreement in the north. Everything is tied together. How close are we to that? Because it seems like we're still stuck on the same argument between Hamas and Israel. Hamas wants a ceasefire to end the war. Israel just agrees to a temporary ceasefire, and this is going nowhere.
This is going nowhere. We're nowhere close to reaching an agreement. In retrospect, and some of this has been said in real time, there was sort of a golden window of opportunity somewhere between January and April. Hamas was hit pretty badly at that time. Israel needed to show a lot of flexibility in order for a deal to be reached. The final deal would have meant an end to all fighting and a total Israeli withdrawal. But it was both Netanyahu and to some extent the army who refused many of the demands and the suggestions raised even by the Qataris and the Egyptians and the Americans at that time. And it was quite clear at that time that Netanyahu wanted to avoid this because of his political problems, because if he went all the way and reached a final agreement, that would have meant admitting that the war was over, that we didn't win this, and that would probably have meant Ben-Gvir and Smotrich resigning from the coalition and the end of his government as we know it. Now, this opportunity was missed partly because of Netanyahu, partly because of Hamas's behavior. Now we're at a different page. By now, the same Sinwar is feeling that he has the upper hand. Of course, the residents of Gaza are suffering. Of course, Hamas itself has lost, between 15 to 20,000 fighters. And yet, this is not over. This is a price he's willing to pay. And once he feels that this is progressing the way he wants, why should he make any kind of concessions? Now, every time we had the possibility of the deal being reached in February, March, or April, what we had was that whenever there was a chance, Netanyahu began leaking to the press his reservations about the possible outcome of an agreement and some of the demands that he was not going to cave to regarding release of prisoners and so on. Now he doesn't even need to do that because Sinwar's latest demands, this answer that he gave the mediators 2 or 3 days ago, the demands are so harsh that there's no way Israel is going to go for it. Now, I suspect that in his heart of hearts, Netanyahu is pretty happy about this situation. This way, no deal is reached, so he doesn't need to make any kind of massive concessions. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir remain on board, and even the Americans are saying that this is Sinwar's fault and not Netanyahu's fault. So win-win for Netanyahu. The problem is that this is not win-win for Israel because, as you mentioned, strategically, we're going nowhere. We're stuck. The whole idea was reach a hostage deal, reach some kind of ceasefire in the south, and then let Hochstein do his thing and reach some kind of an agreement up north. And perhaps in the future, when we're more ready, we deal with both problems, whether it's Sinwar by assassinating him. And I have to say that personally, I'm hoping that this is the way his life or his story ends. And perhaps even a strike, a unilateral Israeli strike against Hezbollah as well. But right now, it's quite evident that we're not ready for this, that after 8 months of fighting, the public is exhausted, the soldiers are exhausted, the top brass want to rest, and Netanyahu himself is not on the top of his game right now. So there are many reasons to suggest that a better solution for Israel right now is to accept that we haven't won this round at all, that we suffered quite a lot, and yet we need to make concessions in order to try and improve our situation, especially because we think of what's lurking in the shadows right now, which is Iran, which is the Iranian attempt to become sort of a mastermind behind all of those attacks from Iraq, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Gaza, and so on. And if we're facing
and from Iran itself.
Yeah, and if we're facing a much bigger challenge, maybe we should start dealing with the bigger problems and not just with the fact that Hamas has humiliated us and murdered our countrymen and raped and mutilated people all across the Gaza envelope. This is a serious matter, but there are perhaps even greater challenges. The problem right now is that after Netanyahu wasted all of this time, Sinwar himself is not willing to play along, and now we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. It's very hard to maneuver under these circumstances.
You made that really interesting distinction between what's in Israel's interest and what's in Netanyahu's interest. And if we had more time, I would ask you what you think has to change, what the Americans could do in particular to change the calculus for Netanyahu, to make it in his interest to get this thing concluded and to accept an even imperfect deal. But because time is short, I'm going to plant that thought. But I also just thought we should ask your view on the departure of Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot from the government and what bearing that has on the military decision making. I mean, Yonit and I, when we were talking earlier, have just said about these things are quite finely balanced, and Netanyahu quite liked being the man in the middle between, one side and the other. And now that's got a bit more lopsided inside the war cabinet. But in terms of just the prosecution of the war, what impact do you think it means that these two people, very with their own big military history, their departure, what does it mean?
Look, they've been hesitating for a long time. As you know, Eisenkot was pushing for a party resignation from the coalition by March. And Gantz, as usual, was not happy to take a decision. He kept delaying. He hoped that something might happen, perhaps something positive might come out of this. And only under extreme pressure from Eisenkot and others did he decide to resign this week. About the outcome, look, Netanyahu is playing it in a sort of complicated kind of way. For instance, there's the war cabinet in which both Eisenkot and Gantz were members. He's actually reconstructing the way decisions are taken now, and there's not going to be a war cabinet anymore because he wants to avoid Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who demand to become members instead of Gantz and Eisenkot. That's the last thing that Netanyahu needs, to have them in all those very serious and long meetings with the top brass from the army, Shin Bet, and Mossad. So he'd like to avoid that. They'll remain at the bigger cabinet, and the small group of people actually making the decisions would include Gallant, Deri, Dermer, and Netanyahu, and that's it. Will we miss Eisenkot and Gantz? They could tell you that during the last 7 or 8 months, they had a contribution to some important decisions, whether it was the decision to block Gallant's proposal to strike Hezbollah in Beirut on October 11th, 4 or 5 days after the war started. Later on, they pushed forward. They convinced Netanyahu to go to the first hostage deal. Remember, at that time, many of the right-wing ministers opposed that. And there were all kinds of discussions in which the army, they didn't necessarily agree on everything, but Herzl Levy, the chief of staff, could enjoy the support of his former commanders, Gantz and Eisenkot, on certain matters. This is not enough of an excuse to remain in office, considering the way the war is handled and where we're going. And it's not only about the war, it's about Yariv Levin's attempts to go back to the judicial overhaul. It's about the way Ben-Gvir has completely taken over the police. It's about police violence against quite calm protests in Tel Aviv against the government. We're seeing very, very bad signs everywhere. The question right now is, will this lead to some kind of a political turmoil? Will this mean that actually finally people would march on the streets the way they did the night Gallant was fired on March 23? Right now, Gantz doesn't have the charisma to lead a revolution here. It's not going to march in the streets in front of hundreds of thousands of people. And yet maybe the political conditions are somewhat slightly changing in a sort of a gradual way. More than anything else, it's about the draft law. Think of what has happened 2 or 3 days ago about this picture, this photograph taken at night after Netanyahu won the vote. You see him smiling from ear to ear, considering the fact that 4 soldiers' lives were lost a few hours earlier in Rafah. Not the right image that he should be projecting, but this is the way it goes. Netanyahu right now, it's all about Netanyahu. There's nothing else there. It's about surviving and protecting his political future. And this is very, very frustrating. Will that push thousands or tens of thousands to the streets? I don't know. But I'm talking to miluimniks, to reservists who have been serving for 150 or 200 days in the last year and know that there's another call waiting them. And they're frustrated. Now, the ultra-orthodox are never going to come and volunteer immediately and fight in Givati and Golani or replace religious Zionists or secular kids fighting in the paratroopers brigade. Okay, it's not going to happen anytime soon. And yet the fact that the burden is not shared in any kind of way, this is far too much for most Israelis to bear. Maybe something good would come out of this. I'm not sure that Gantz would lead the way, but perhaps the combination of the two, trends might lead us somewhere.
Amos Harel, you made us smarter. I'm not sure you made us more optimistic, but we really appreciate you coming on Unholy and sharing your point of view. Thank you so much.
Thanks again.
Thank you, Amos, so much. As you say, always enlightening to speak with Amos Harel, even if it's not necessarily cheering. But the sort of comprehensive take we got from him there.
There's this line in Patrick Marber's play Closer, where he says, "What's so good about the truth? Try lying for a change. It's the currency of the world." I mean, Amos speaks the truth, and sometimes it's a bit depressing, but you need to listen to it. I think there are 2 points just to pick up on the end of what he said in the draft bill and all of that conversation. 2 things we should notice. One is that Netanyahu is trying, there's only one, he has the eye on the date, and the date is 28th of July. That's when the Knesset goes into its summer recess, and it's going to be very, very hard to topple the government in that period until it comes back for its winter session, for the Knesset's winter session at the end of October. So he's very focused on that. He's trying to buy time as much as he can. That's why you saw this draft bill continuation. But we need to also keep our eyes on the ball on what's happening next week. It should be probably next week when the High Court of Justice delivers its decision on the fact that there is no draft bill. And if, for example, the High Court of Justice decides yes to enlist all of the ultra-Orthodox or thousands of them that have not been enlisted thus far, and you could hear the echoes in the first deliberations where the judges, even conservative judges, like Noam Solberg, saying things like, why only 3,000 ultra-Orthodox to be enlisted? We're in the middle of the war. You might need more. I'm paraphrasing, but that is essentially what he was saying. If you have a decision like that, that can throw a lot of turmoil, the government into a whole lot of turmoil, and you don't know where that ends.
Yeah, but if the game is running out the clock, there are few better maestros of that game than Netanyahu, and 26th of July will look very achievable for him when he's got that date ringed on the calendar. Each week we note how the war on the ground is mirrored or echoed very far away in the debate, the argument that rages around the world about the war. That came to New York in very dramatic fashion this last week. An exhibition on the Nova Music Festival opened in the financial district of New York City. Very powerful exhibit by all accounts, but a lot of attention on these huge, loud and noisy protests outside, people protesting. And I saw video of one of the rally speakers who said that it was a disgrace to commemorate the people at the Nova Music Festival because they were the equivalent of people who were, dancing and having a rave by the gas chambers. That's what she said. She said, if you've seen the film Zone of Interest, this is beyond Zone of Interest, what happened at the Nova Music Festival. It's a pretty sick argument that was made to great cheers by one of the speakers outside. Obviously, people will say, oh, there were other protests who weren't the same. It just gives you a little flavour of at least some of the sentiment expressed by protesters. And then separately, the Brooklyn Museum, not a Jewish museum, just the Brooklyn Museum, had protests outside the museum back in May and had objected to those protests, as if in revenge for that, 4 homes of people linked to the museum, including the museum director, Anne Pasternak, had their homes vandalized with fake blood, with graffiti, with signs, absolutely splashed with this red fake blood, and inverted red triangles, which are said to be a symbol that Hamas uses to identify targets for violence. In a statement put out seemingly by the people who were behind this, who claimed to be, artists and cultural workers rather than just, random vandals, they put out a statement saying the Brooklyn Museum is an institution tainted with the blood of our martyrs. So violence and, violent damage, as well as noisy and raucous protests outside people who are not themselves combatants. In one case, an exhibition dedicated to the memory of those killed at the Nova Music Festival and taken hostage. In other case, not even really related, but, for Jewish people linked to a museum, having their homes vandalized and covered in blood. It's pretty alarming.
Yeah, I mean, and we were all under the impression that this anti-Semitism that erupted after October 7th would at some point die down. It's been 8 months, and if anything, it just seems worse than it did months ago. I don't know what can be done besides more and more people who aren't from the Jewish community, joining together and saying enough is enough. And obviously all the criminal charges put against these people. But I'm really, I look at this and I don't know what to do. When you see these protests in front of the exhibition about the Nova Festival, which really is one of the is ground zero for us Israelis, and I think not only for Israelis. I mean, what more needs to happen for this world to not be so upside down? I really don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting your point about you had hoped and that it would get calmer. If anything, I'm afraid I think the tipping point and the turning point was the legitimation of the word genocide in this context. The ICJ interim judgment, they didn't say it was genocide. They said that they just accepted that there was a case, that there was a risk under the Genocide Convention, which meant that Palestinians required protection. Very, very different. They just essentially were saying, we'll hear the case. But that set this unleashed this kind of rhetoric. And so therefore you see people outside that Nova Music Festival believing that saying that they, that somehow the people at the Nova Music Festival, and you've seen this on social media too, require no more sympathy than as if there was some, Jewish resistance against Germans in the period of the Shoah. I mean, it's like I said, I think it's pretty sick, and it's morally upside down to think that somehow there is, young people dancing at a music festival are some kind of legitimate target. But I do think that we're living with the consequences of this escalation of the rhetoric, this idea that that's now written about and said as if it's not even contestable, a genocide is going on, and therefore your moral duty is to stand against this. And so I think it's going to get louder and louder until, in a way, that argument is rebutted and diffused. And I think I've said before, I don't think any of that argument can really happen until this thing is over. While it's ongoing, no one is thinking straight, and you're getting situations like this. I think it's a very, very alarming turn. Meanwhile, this is the year of elections all over the world. There were elections in India. There are elections right now in Britain. Big one in November in the United States. Not yet in Israel. Somehow it's managing to hold out, which we've said before is extraordinary. But there was a round of elections across the European Union, votes tallied last weekend for the European Parliament. 27 member countries taking part. And again, from the angle we look at the world, some alarming developments there, because significant gains for parties, not just of the right, but of the far right in Italy, France, and Germany. Significant gains. For example, AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, which has a sinister ring to it, even just its name. The party of Le Pen in France, coming top of the poll there. In fact, in 5 of the 27 member countries, far-right parties came first, and they came second or third in 5 other countries. It was liberal, sort of centrist, often green parties that were losing out. Obviously, there is alarm for that. Important caveat, in countries where the far-right have been in government, either in the past or still, far-right parties did not do so well in Poland and in Hungary, for example. But in those big countries, France and Germany, it certainly caught attention. Emmanuel Macron has then rolled the dice in an incredibly high-risk gamble by calling early parliamentary elections there, which, if they replicated what happened last weekend, you would be seeing a Le Pen-led government that he would have to swear in. I mean, that's an amazing idea. But he's rolling the dice that everyone else will unite against that, as they have done in previous elections. But inevitably, a lot of attention on the AfD in Germany, partly because of its history, the history of the country, but even the AfD's history of seeming to sort of soft soap, to slightly airbrush the history. Plenty of AfD leaders have over the years said, enough of this generation having to bear the guilt of their fathers and grandfathers, that's not fair. But here's the twist on this, which, is perhaps unexpected. The AfD is positioning itself in some ways as not an anti-Jewish party, but on the contrary, somehow pro-Jewish, because it is saying its big issue is Muslim immigration. And it has been even targeting looking for Jewish support by saying that it's, as some of these far-right parties are pro-Israel, but also very centrally anti-Muslim and trying to stir Jewish support as a result. There is even a sort of Jewish, base of supporters, small but existent inside the AfD. There are some Jewish supporters. So these are complicated results, but I think very troubling ones.
So just one note on a country that so far doesn't look like it's having elections. But when you look at that trajectory towards the far right and what is happening in Israel, phenomenons like Itamar Ben-Gvir, who used to be ostracized from the political sphere because of his opinions, essentially Kahanist opinions of the far right, and the fact that he is now the Minister of National Security. Obviously, this has to do with Netanyahu's decision, but also with the political power he himself, Ben-Gvir himself, has amassed. And that is because of this political trend. It has to do with that as well. The political trend, or the global trend of moving more to the right, and these populist far-right leaders who suggest a simple solution to the most complicated problems. And a lot of people would vote for that. So I think it's also important when you look at something like Itamar Ben-Gvir here in Israel to see that as part of a global phenomenon.
It is awards time, and nowhere in the world loves giving itself awards more than Hollywood, and it is to Hollywood that our chutzpah category turns, Yonit.
Rather elegantly done, Mr. Friedland. Yes, indeed. We are dealing with the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in LA. Now, the story begins by the fact that they have not had, for 2.5 years, as long as the museum has been open, mention of the history of the industry's Jewish beginning. Now, just to pause on that for a moment, to talk about the history of Hollywood without specifically mentioning Jews is like talking about, the history of New York without mentioning Jews, the history of Jews without mentioning Jews. I mean, it is just impossible to do that. So after 2.5 years of pressure, finally, the museum decided to have an exhibition. It's called Hollywoodland, Jewish Founders and the Making of a Movie Capital. The problem is that many people noted that the way the Jewish founders of Hollywood are treated and depicted in this exhibition is actually very, very problematic. Now, a letter has come out, organized by United Jewish Writers, talking about the fact that this is really vilifying the people that you're supposed to be celebrating, that the exhibition uses words like womanizer, like oppressive, tyrant is another word that's in that exhibition, and kind of saying, you're blaming Jews for a problematic past that was true to all of Hollywood, but specifically you're now writing this about them. So I've been talking to a dear friend who has been telling me this whole story for a few weeks now, and he said, the upsetting thing about this is that, again, Jews have to they're the only people who have to stand up for themselves and say, listen, this is not okay. And I think this, in some way, they kind of expected other people to join in on this. But I think that the museum itself definitely deserves the Chutzpah Award of this week.
Yeah, no, that's a good choice. I mean, I think it was with David Baddiel on the podcast. He was here talking about how weird it was that Hollywood had a museum about Jews. It was like an example, he said, of Jews don't count. And yet when they go to make amends, they criticize, and I think this point has been made by some of the critics, they criticize Jews in a way they didn't do in any other group who were highlighted in the museum. So there is a part of the museum, I think, about African Americans in Hollywood. No one thought they would describe those individuals in these very negative, critical terms. It is somehow an example, I think, of his Jews don't count logic there in Hollywood land. For our Mensch Award, I think we're going to go back to our European elections story, mainly gloomy and troubling news, as we were saying. But the party of the French left, led by, for these European parliamentary elections, by one Raphael Glucksmann, a Jewish writer, filmmaker, did rather better than expected. They did better than they'd done before, and they did better than most of the European left in these elections. And the reason why I particularly single out Raphael Glucksmann is very interesting, sort of, charismatic, younger figure. So he's had to walk this line. He's come under a lot of pressure from people on the left in France to use, for example, the word genocide in regards to the treatment of Palestinians by Israel. And he has refused to use the term, instead saying he's extremely cautious about when that word should be used. Maybe that shouldn't be a big deal, but in the current climate, the current atmosphere, it is a big deal. And he has shown a way, amongst other things, to how this far-right surge can be repelled. So a shout out at the very least to Raphael Glucksmann of France.
So we are winding up our show this week and saying our thank yous to Gaia Glaser, Omer Primat, Omri Barak, and we shall meet next week, Jonathan.
I'll see you then, Yonit.